Good evening. Our guest this evening is a man who, in no small way, over a period of almost half a century, has helped to influence the direction of this country. A minister in Ted Heath's government in the 1970s, a cabinet minister in the Thatcher government in the 1980s, deputy prime minister in John Major's government in the 90s, an advisor to the Cameron Osborne government in the noughties. He has never been far from the center of political decision-making, and for long periods, he was at the very heart of these decisions. His extraordinarily successful political, business, and publishing careers read like a gripping novel, filled with drama, tension, thrills, and spills, but for the fact that they were all too real, shaping his life and the lives of his wife Anne, their 3 children, and their 9 grandchildren. And so it is with very great pleasure that I welcome Lord Michael Heseltine.
How nice to join you for this our chat, Dave.
And Michael, it is really an honor to be able to spend this time with you, and thank you for agreeing to it. And thank you also to your longtime friend and lawyer, and I hope that it's in that order, Charles Corman, for suggesting this.
Oh, an invaluable part of my life, Charles. Kept me on the straight and narrow.
He's kept most of us on the straight and narrow. That's his job in our synagogue. Michael, it's very tempting to spend this time together going back to some of the highlights of your career and revisiting some of the old memories. But I'm going to resist that temptation, really for 2 reasons. Firstly, because those conversations and interviews have already been conducted by others who are more skilled than me. And can I, by the way, recommend to our viewers the outstanding 2-part TV series, which is available on YouTube, which was made by London Weekend Television in the year 2000 and was presented by John Dimbleby. And it was presented to tie in with the publication of Lord Heseltine's memoirs, Life in the Jungle. So that's the first reason why we're not going back to that. But the second is because it feels as if Britain today is at a crossroads, geopolitically, culturally, socially. We face the immediate challenges of a global health pandemic, a new relationship with the European Union, and looking ahead, rising Scottish nationalism. So the direction that we take now will affect us and our children, just as the decisions that you took, Michael, during your time in government helped to shape the country for a generation. And so therefore it seems to be important that we should use this time together to draw on your vast experience and your wisdom in government and a lifetime of public life, just to reflect on and to examine some of the issues, and particularly the moral issues that are facing us, if, of course, you agree.
Oh, I'm more than happy to.
Well, that's great, because otherwise it would have been a very short conversation. We need to start with the elephant in the room. We can't avoid it. Brexit is 5 weeks away. There's still no deal. Your views on Brexit, the conduct of the referendum campaign, the wisdom of having a referendum in the first place are very well known, but we are where we are. And if you were in government now, with the clock ticking, what would you do? Deal or no deal?
Well, a no deal would be materially worse in the short term because of the chaos it would produce. In the longer term, it wouldn't make that much difference. The Brexit decision is of massive significance, and it is, in my view, without upside. It is a disastrous misjudgment based on the worst sort of human instincts of nationalism and all those sort of things we've seen in extreme movements before. There is no good news. And the tragedy is that COVID is the sort of curtain on what is happening. I mean, COVID is horrendous, but my own belief and hope is that the vaccine is the way out. I don't think there's any other way out. Nobody's found one. There's no major difference between what's happening in this country and other similar economies. So the vaccine is the way out. But I think that could be a relatively quick way out. But that will just draw the curtain back on Brexit. And of course, we should have some sort of deal if we can. But the enormity of Brexit is not going to be determined by whether there's a deal or not. So what would I be doing? Well, I wouldn't be there. I mean, forgive me for saying that, but it's obvious I would not have had anything to do with Brexit. I spent my political life certainly from the 40s, arguing in favour of what every Conservative Prime Minister argued for, which was to become one of the leading European nations in a configuration of European nations which reflected what was happening across the world. And that judgment in the 1940s was visionary, but today it is manifestly obvious that you have got geo-significant powers, America, China, and the world is shrinking under the influences of this internationalism that is taking place. You can see Asia is drawing together, Europe is drawing together, even Africa, which is quite a long way behind the process, even Africa is beginning to move in that direction.
You'll be familiar, and I don't want this to become a Brexit conversation because we want to move on to talk about other things, but I'm sure you'll be familiar with some of the arguments on the other side that want to suggest that there have been some fundamental shifts in what Britain has to offer, that it's not the old manufacturing, that it's the new services, the special life, the skills that we have in the life sciences, the skills that we have in AI and in technology, etc., and that these are a different set of skills, and that those who are harping back to the old relationship with Europe are simply missing some of the global opportunities which lie for us outside of Europe, and that there are new skills that Britain has to offer, and that those who harp back to the past are, in a sense, dinosaurs who are not understanding the way in which Britain has shifted. Do you buy any of those arguments at all?
Not at all. I mean, self-evidently, one of the most obvious examples of the skills which have powered us in this economy is our financial services centre. And we are the financial centre of Europe. That is hugely advantageous to the United Kingdom. Well, we've cut that off. And I can tell you, whatever anyone says, that slowly, remorselessly, the power will shift to Frankfurt and Paris with the active support of the French and German governments. Other countries will try to get their share of it itself, and it will happen. It doesn't mean that it destroys the City of London. It just undermines its position to be a world player. Take space. I was, forgive me for saying so, but probably the leading person to help create the European Space Agency, because what we in Britain could afford was Toy Town. And what the Germans and French could afford, again, was Toy Town. I remember the figures. The whole European spend in the 1970s was £200 million a year. The American spend at that time was 6 times the size, 1.2 billion. But our 200 million was fragmented between the nation states, all trying to compete with each other. So what have we done? We've left the European Space Agency and the Galileo project, in which Britain was a leading member. And we're now going to try and do it on our own. So I don't buy any of this stuff that we are stronger outside. We were stronger inside with the basis of that huge market from which to expand in the way that, for example, the Germans never felt held back by the European community. They just used it as a domestic base in which to become a major exporting country.
Let's come back to COVID that you've already touched upon. When you were president of the Board of Trade, you very famously said that you would intervene before breakfast, lunch, tea, and supper on behalf of British business, and that when you woke up the next morning, you would intervene again. So does the same apply now in regard to government response, in regard to the economic impact of COVID?
They've come round to realise that that's what governments do. And they always have, and they always will. It's just that our particular political system tend to have focused on the extremes, the extreme left, who remorselessly wanted to own the commanding heights of the economy and therefore nationalize them, or the extreme right, who think that the private sector on its own can solve all problems. Neither is true. And so if you look at what is actually happening, I mean, take technology, which is changing the world at a breathtaking speed.
And we're experiencing it right now in this conversation.
They can see this in any part of the world. It's incredible. Now, if you look at the American space budget and the American defense budget, which is of a scale we can't begin to imagine, that is force-feeding the American industrial base. And they're brilliant in that industrial base at exploiting the technology that the government is paying for. And I've lived with this problem all through my early years. I've mentioned space, but then I saw it in the defense, where we were always asked to buy American equipment, which the taxpayer in America had obviously financed and developed, and we were going to then be sold it at the marginal cost of production. Well, that's fine, but you won't have a defense base yourself in that circumstance. And so it goes on. The whole of this phenomenon of the communications revolution has come off the American space and defense budgets. And so the idea that somehow or other we can command from a nation of 60 million the sort of resources that China and America are throwing at these problems is simply naive. But we could do a great deal more in the context of the European coalition, and that's what I believe in.
It's worthwhile remembering, by the way, that GPS that we all use pretty much every day of our lives was started as a military invention, which trickled down then into the consumer use. That's another form in which I suppose. But you were a lone voice, weren't you? I mean, in those days when you were banging on the lectern, about intervention, Mrs. Thatcher was livid about it, and your colleagues in government, were against you for it. You really were pushing against the stream at that time.
Margaret and I didn't really agree about these things. She was of a much more right-wing disposition. But, if you look behind the curtain once again, Margaret agreed to let me walk the streets of Liverpool in the height of the 1981 crisis for 3 weeks. She never stopped me in the next 18 months, becoming probably the most interventionist Secretary of State that we've ever had. I literally was a clerk of works in Liverpool with about 30 projects in a notebook, which I masterminded every Thursday night and troubleshot on the Friday, in order to prove to people in Liverpool, look, there's a way forward. We can do better.
This I'm presuming, is in the after the Toxteth riots that you.
Yes, I felt a personal responsibility because I'd been responsible for Liverpool in the central government from 1979. I had produced the Development Corporation to tackle the problems on the Bank of the Mersey. I had listed the Albert Dock, and I had created the concept of the Garden Festival there. So I'd done quite a lot. And then they rioted. And I thought, well, heck, I haven't done enough. I haven't understood enough. So I said to Margaret, look, you've got a simple choice here. We can stand back and say, back the police, law and order, jobs on the streets. We cannot in any way compromise. And that's a perfectly legitimate and reasonable government response, but it's not a sufficient government response. And my bones told me there was something more fundamental. And of course, I then spent 3 weeks walking the streets, and it was apparent what was wrong. Everybody knew what was wrong. You were wrong, they were wrong, she was wrong, he was wrong. Never me. Nobody was prepared to stand up and say, follow me. Let's do it this way. That's what I spent 18 months doing. saying, look, this is a bombed out site. Let's put something on it. Who's going to pay? Where's the money coming from? What are we going to put on it? And it worked.
I want to come back to some of the issues of Toxteth a little bit later, but just to stick with COVID for the moment and the issue of intervention, there is really a difficult decision to be made by government, an unenviable one at this point in time, in striking the balance between saving lives and saving the economy. And I wonder whether you feel that we've got that balance right, and if you were in a position of government today, whether you would be doing anything different to what the Chancellor has suggested, or the Prime Minister.
Look, I have no medical or scientific knowledge. I am not briefed about any of the detail of this horrendous plague from which we're suffering. And I know enough of life, as you will know as a rabbi, that the easiest thing in life is to say, oh, well, if only they'd listen to me, what they should be doing, what they ought to have done, all this sort of stuff with the benefits of hindsight. I won't do that. I can't see any serious case which says that this government here has done significantly better or worse than equivalent economies across the world. They're all trying. They've got no choice, but I salute them because that's their proper responsibility. And the only way out, frankly, is the vaccine. So I give the benefit of the doubt to the government, and I'm not going to pretend that I have got some sort of magic wand that if I was there, I'd do it differently or do it better.
It is a kind of a Hobson's choice, though, isn't it? Because
it's exactly that. And people perhaps, well, you can't blame people. They're asked for a reaction. They get 30 seconds clip on television to expand their whole philosophy. Of course, you get a gross oversimplification, but you're absolutely right. On the one side of the scales is human life and human condition. On the other is the state of the economy. And they're both linked, because the more you do to protect life now, the more damage you do to the economy in the longer term. So it's the most appalling dilemma for the government.
And they're horrendously intertwined, because it's one thing to separate human life and economy, but if the economy suffers enormously, ultimately that's going to impact upon people's standards of living, and if it impacts upon people's standards of living, it's going to impact upon their health, and then it will impact upon lives. So you actually can't separate the two, and to know where to draw the line, it must be enormously, enormously difficult.
It's a nightmare.
But on this whole issue of intervention, I mean, Boris Johnson once described himself as a Brexity Hezza, using your nickname, Hezza, from the old days. And I'm not sure whether you consider this to be a flattering comparison or not, but can you see some shades of Hezza, of the path that you didn't just tread it, you actually blazed it, in terms of the government's approach currently to its philosophy, the response to the pandemic, the drafting the army into Nightingale hospitals, some of the emergency economic measures, public investment, the levelling up agenda. All of this would seem to flow from the political philosophy that you engendered in those early years. Is that the way you understand the direction of the government today?
Well, actually, I don't think there's anything very new in government intervening. Government always intervene on a massive scale. Though education system is largely financed by the government, and that's one of the most important economic stimulants there are. The research budgets of universities are largely financed by governments. And you will find a whole range of regional policies in which government provides help of one sort and another to companies. You can go on and on. So it's a question of whether you strike the balance, and if you admit the fact that really it's not a question of principle or absolutism, it's a question of where the line is drawn. And I perhaps been privileged, having been in the space responsibilities early in the 70s, and then defense, and then industry. I have seen the real world that exists out there, not just in this country, but across the advanced world. And I know, therefore, something about the competitive forces that are at work. Um, and you just can't escape from the fact that the fingers of government are everywhere. Now, I have to just make this clear point. I'm basically a small businessman. I mean, that's where life started. That's where my family were. And I didn't do, I made some terrific mistakes, but I came out all right on the plus side, the positive side of the balance sheet. But my views changed without any doubt from the traditional small businessman, get off my backs, get rid of red tape, all that stuff. What I now know is that red tape is really the difference between the jungle and civilization. If you think about it, if you leave the market has no morality. If you leave the market to rip, it will rip. It will do whatever it has to do, because there's always someone at the bottom of the pile who doesn't give a damn and will do whatever they can to grasp a bit more for themselves. And so whether it's safety, whether it's health, whether it's environment, whatever, all these things, the government has to intervene. And my first revolt against my party in the 1960s was over the intervention which the Labour Party intended to make on race relations. And at that time, I had a small employment agency and I had a small hotel. I knew what was going on. There's no point mucking about. I knew that we were being asked by employers to send details of potential employees, no colours, written all across the paper. I saw people, when our hotel was full, unfortunately not that frequently, booked into neighbouring hotels. And then by the time I got them from our hotel 30 seconds up the road, they said they were full because the guy I took was black. So I knew what was going on. And when my party said that it was going to vote against the Labour Party's race relations bill, I wouldn't do it. And 3 weeks later, my party changed its mind. Quite right. I was the first conservative to criticise Enoch Powell. I thought that was an immoral speech. And I'll tell you why it was immoral.
The Rivers of Blood, the famous Rivers of Blood.
1968. The reason it was immoral is because it gave an impression to a certain section of society that they were going to get something done about the levels of immigration. The feeling was, somehow they would go away, they'd be sent home, they wouldn't come, whatever it may be. But the speech actually had no positive proposals in it at all. So it was whetting appetites, and that was what was immoral about it.
There is something in your upbringing, Michael, and I'm not, perhaps help me to understand where it comes from, but you have had throughout your career such a sense of abhorrence of racial injustice, indicated once again in your what was at the time a very, very daring and personally risky move in terms of your own security at the time of the Toxteth riots, marching in over there and being prepared to speak to the people in that crowded room with people baying at you and not believing that government would ever listen to the things we're going to say, etc. So this very strong sense that you have, this abhorrence against anything of a racial nature, where does this come from in your whole upbringing, in your whole outlook? Is this Christian Protestant deep within you, or something else?
I couldn't pretend that it's a deep Protestant upbringing because I didn't have that. My parents were Catholic Protestant. Religion didn't play a big part in our lives. I can't really, you don't know the answer to these questions. You can invent them and sort of fantasize as to where it all comes from. But I don't really know why. I was born and brought up in, perhaps I do know one thing. I was born and brought up in Swansea, in South Wales.
Yes.
And a comfortable middle-class family. But it wasn't that far before you saw a very different world. And I was conscious of that world. And I remember very vividly, when I was about 16, I was away at school at Shrewsbury, and I wandered from the campus, the school campus, down into the town. And I don't remember exactly the journey, but I remember turning a corner, And there was a very attractive little girl, about 4 or 5, and she was very dirty and unkempt, and she looked just like my sister, and it shook me. I suppose again, when I first went to work in the City of London in 1955, the hordes of people pouring across the bridges to work in those great offices sort of made something inside me stir and say, is this right? What sort of society is it? Now, it didn't last long, let me tell you any of this. I joined the Conservative Party in 1951 and have been an enthusiastic and energetic supporter of it through thick and thin, with one notable exception in the last election. No, I know what I think is right or wrong. I was horrified by Enoch Powell, and I supported measures to do something about it. But the one you mentioned, of course, the Toxters one, that was not easy, I can tell you. And I remember exactly what happened. I just arrived for this 3-week thing, and I had a public meeting in which to sort of set the scene. And as I was going into the meeting, there was quite a lot of people and quite a lot of Toxteth inhabitants there, the black community. As I was going in, one of the journalists said, they're going to stage a walkout, in a whisper. And so I thought, oh my God. He said, they'll only talk to you if you go to them. So here I was. I had to do my speech, and all through the speech, I knew what was coming.
But if I could just interrupt for a moment. So you've drawn up, you've arrived in a fancy Jaguar wearing a very, very smart suit and a nice tie, and you look the absolute epitome of the conservative English gent. You are miles away in terms of image from the people you're trying to connect with.
Well, I am what I am.
We all.
So anyway, the true to what I've been told, after a few, after 10 minutes, 20 minutes, up they go, and out they went. And there was no riot, no fuss, no row. They just went. Probably said something quite abusive as they went, but anyway, it was all quite peaceful. But when I got outside after the meeting, there were the cameras. Secretary of State, they said they will not talk to you unless you go to them. And I had one of those split-second moments in life where there's no way you can get out of it, You could have said, well, I'll think about it, but that would have been pretty wet. Anyway, I said, fine, that's all right with me. I'll go. And we went, and we had 200 of them in a room, and they were all between me and the door. And the most tense meeting of my life. Anyway,
Are you scared?
Yes, I was apprehensive. When my bodyguard, my security officer, was told he wasn't allowed in because he was armed. He was armed, and he wasn't allowed in. But unless perhaps he had to take his gun away. I can't remember. But anyway, it was frightening.
I think he said that he gave his gun to one of your aides sitting in the car because he didn't want it to be stolen.
Yeah, okay, well, that was his business. It didn't consult me. I got on with what I had to do. But it was a tense meeting. But of course, I hope it did something to lower the temperature, because I answered all their questions. May not like some of the answers, but they got them. And I was very patient, and I did listen. And the temperature never rose above 0 in that meeting. So both of us learned something.
So, in terms of some of the race issues, and by the way, speaking as a Jew, I'm sure that many of the members of our audience tonight will feel this as well. The rise of anti-Semitism is something which is very, very concerning for us, and gives us a great sense of discomfort that it should rear its ugly head, so vociferously. But putting that aside, the whole issue of the Black Lives Matter movement in this past summer, starting in America and spreading across here to the United Kingdom. Are there parallels now between then and between now and the 1980s? Do we require similar interventions?
Well, I think,
sorry, just to make the question a bit stronger, if I may, is this an imported American problem, not our problem?
well, I think that it's a human problem. And it's a problem which emerges throughout history with frightening frequency. And it is all about the basic human tribalism that I think most of us understand to be there, however much we may regret and however much we may fight against it. But in the end, most of us feel some sort of tribal loyalty based on our background and our circumstance. That's not to defend that in any way, but you as a Jew, how do I tell you about the consequences that that has had? But if you go back far enough, what about the Protestant and Catholic treatments in this country? What about the slavery in another generation? What about the marches in the 1930s? I was there. I mean, when I say I was there, I was alive when Mosley was leading his people to the East End of London. When the Dockers marched for Enoch Powell, was it a different thing altogether? I don't think it was that different. So Black Lives Matter. Well, of course they do. But in my view, all lives matter. And I think all human people basically have the same instincts in one scale or another. The most appalling things have been done to the Jews, but most appalling things have been done in the name of religion in quite different circumstances. So I hope I'm clearly on the side of behaving properly and the equality of mankind and the equality of opportunity and civilized behavior. But I think that these awful gut instincts which you see are there, have been there all through history, and they are to be recognized and fought against.
But the problem is, Michael, it's all very well to say, it pops up from time to time, but the real problem is that we haven't fixed it. And is it fixable? If it's just a matter of human nature and it's going to, it's tribalism, etc., that's a rather it's a rather despairing view of how we can ever fix some of the ills of society. Here is a large group of people who feel that despite whatever efforts have been made in the past in British society, it hasn't worked, and there's still marginalization, and there's still inequality, and that successive governments have not paid enough attention to it until such time as people begin to shout, ouch, and then everybody jumps up and says, oh, the world is going to change from this point onwards, and then nothing very much changes. It's a little bit like those people shouting at you back in Toxteth. They didn't believe you would do anything. Governments don't do anything. They come and they say they're going to listen, and then they go away and they do absolutely nothing. And that's the cry that we hear at this point in time from within the broader disenfranchised or group of people who feel themselves to be very disenfranchised. So what's the problem? Why can't there be greater equality? Why can't we fix it? Why has no government ever found the way to be able to make the lives of that group of people better?
Well, the truth, of course, is that they have found the way of making the lives of many of those people incomparably better. But I remain with the basic view I advanced. You cannot eradicate human nature. And there are traits in human nature which need to be controlled and fought against. And I think that the system of parliamentary democracy that Britain has done so much to spread across the world has had the most extraordinarily beneficial effects. Now, if you say to me, are we all now good, nice people? Well, that's ridiculous, because you know as well as I do that in every society there are people who do not conform to that distinction. And I have to tell you, I do not believe that there is a way government can so change the circumstance that they change the harsh reality that there are some people who are not as nice as we would like. But if you then look across the world as time has gone on, the condition of the people in this country compared with 50 years ago is unrecognizable. And I don't need to tell you this, but if you think of what has happened to the Jewish people since, say, over my lifetime, I mean, the Jewish influence and stake in our society today is immensely impressive. But so is the Asian stake, an immigration that came much later and has advanced very rapidly. And for the vast majority, and the interesting thing, of course, is that where the integration has been most significant, the tolerance has been the greatest. A lot of the Brexit stuff, which is all frankly tied up with the same sort of basic emotions, is where the immigration has been less penetrating. And I remember in my constituency in Tavistock in the West Country in the 60s, when Enoch made that speech, I mean, there were no black people, but the people that I was talking to and lived amongst they could hardly speak with their support for what Enoch was saying. So I take a much more optimistic view than you do about what is happening in the civilized world. And, is all well? Well, no, everything is not all well. But my golly, compared with history, if I may be brutal, if I'd behaved 300 years ago the way I've behaved in my life, I'd have lost my head.
Indeed. But when we had this conversation a short while ago about interventionism from government and its role in economics and it compared to its seemingly more limited role in being able to influence some of these issues we've been talking about now, which, unable to fix it in its entirety, it doesn't belong to government. It can set some democratic principles. It can create an environment of opportunity for everybody. It can remove some of the prejudices in workplaces, etc. But ultimately, I think you're suggesting, if I understood you correctly, that it's not really government's role in its entirety to be able to deal with these issues. Have I understood correctly in that regard?
I didn't say that. I said the government is properly responsible to do what they can. And that's going back to the race relations legislation. That was a proper government intervention to make sure that the whole force of the law was brought to bear in a way that has undoubtedly had very significant benefits. So government has responsibilities. What I did say is that we would not persuade me that within the power of a government is the ability to change human nature.
So that, and whether human nature can be changed at all by any intervention is, of course, a matter of great debate. But there is another dimension here. We're mourning at the moment in the Jewish community, and I think in many parts of the country, the loss of one of our most powerful moral voices, Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was our former chief rabbi. And as you know, speaking from his perch in the Lords and as an international speaker, he spoke very eloquently and cogently and persuasively about the moral challenges that face our society and the way in which we have to draw from another source, a moral source, which in overall terms we would call biblical. The whole issue of Christian values or Jewish values or Judeo-Christian values and the way in which they're able to influence and input into society really depends very much on the balance, the way in which religion is permitted or is seen to be desirable to play a part in society. Now, I don't want to turn this into a religious discussion because we want to keep religion out of it for lots of good reasons. But nevertheless, this is fundamentally a country which is based upon Christian values. The Church of England is at the very heart of the country and expressed in the role of the sovereign, etc. In the post-war years, it's moved much more towards becoming a multicultural, multi-religious kind of country. And when you talk about the time of Enoch Powell, many people would not have encountered people of a different culture. Today, certainly if you live in the metropolitan areas in London or around, we've become hugely multicultural. Is there a role? You've declared yourself not to have had a religious upbringing, and I don't mean religious in any kind of coercive form. I'm talking about religion as a moral force. Do you think that in this country, compared to, say, America or European countries like France, have we achieved the right balance? Is there another role for the moral voice in this country which comes from somewhere within the religious establishment?
I think that the religious establishment will assert its views and its teachings, and in the context of our lifetime, those likely to be beneficial. They haven't always been beneficial. Some of the religious divides of history have been amongst the most awful in the consequences they had. But into modern world, I'm sure that there is a role for the message from a religion. But you're quite right in referring to multiculturalism, because which religion? I mean, you have a very powerful faith in Judaism, but what about the Muslims and the Hindus and the Catholics and the Protestants and the Presbyterians? And I'm not in any way, I don't want to be in any way critical of the convictions that lead to these judgments or to the benefits that may flow from these judgments. But the question I think you haven't asked, but I must ask, can you be good without a religious background?
Oh, I'd say categorically yes.
Right. Well, then you and I have agreed, because being good has to be a reflection of what you yourself feel to be right. Now, you can immediately say to me, but if you feel something to be right, there must be some outside force, some spiritual endeavor, and that is where we could spend the rest of the evening discussing. But my own view is that the one thing I can do is observe my fellow creatures. I see lots of very good people who do not subscribe to one particular religion or another, or indeed any religion.
I have a very strong belief in the decency of all human beings, and the capacity of every human being to be able to lead a good and a moral life. Religion is a wrapper. It takes you lots of other places. It does lots of other important things. It does have a moral voice, and an important moral voice. And I would also argue that many of the feelings of what is right, etc., eventually have actually filtered down from a Judeo-Christian ethic and morality, etc. But again, that is another conversation, on another occasion.
Because you, I think you said, but I wanted to hear whether I was right, that you have a faith in all people's ability to display this beneficial morality.
Yes, I believe in humanity.
That you think that? You don't think that there are some people who are so outside the convention of the standards you and I would subscribe to, that there isn't any actual justification for believing that there's any good to be found in them at all?
It is perfectly possible for every human being to become so distorted that they lose all perspective of what is right and wrong. But it doesn't mean to say that they may not have the capacity for right and wrong. circumstances, upbringing, personality, and lots of other things. Is there evil in the world? Yes, of course there's evil in the world. Are there evil people in the world? Yes, of course there are evil people in the world. But in overall terms, one believes in the goodness of human beings and in their capacity to be able to become better human beings and to create good society. If one didn't believe that, one would have to throw up your hands and say, well, it's time to go and live in a cave somewhere.
I agree with what you've just said, but you have also said there are evil people. And sadly, I'm afraid that there are such people.
Indeed there are. Indeed there are.
No sense of community, no obligations. It's simply the worst manifestation of bigotry, prejudice, and self-interest.
Well, why did you throw yourself into public life to such an extent? I mean, you've devoted much of your life to. I know you enjoyed it enormously, and that you were very, very good at it, and that from your days at Oxford and the debating society, etc., that you'd found your role, but there's a very strong, as I read your background and your story and the positions that you've taken, the principled positions that you've taken in politics, on the occasions when you have, defied your party, or you have defied directly the prime minister on two occasions, one of which led to your resignation and 3 years in the political wilderness. No doubt there's a certain element of competitiveness and of ego, etc. But there's something else that's driven you, isn't there, Michael?
Well, you don't sort of have a sort of tick box as you go through life saying this is the crossroads. I mean, I find it really quite difficult to separate off what I like doing, what instinct inclined me to do. I wanted to make money. I had the chance. I had a bit of success there. I love gardening. I've been a gardener all my life. And public life enables you to play on. A friend of mine once put it, he said, Michael, the truth is it's the center of the stage. Now, you can immediately say, oh, what you mean is vainglorious enough, you like the spotlight, you want to show off, all that sort of stuff. You can. But I hope it's more than that. I hope that one just feels one has a certain aptitude, a certain energy, and a certain ability to make a difference. And you get a satisfaction from that. Now, you can immediately say, oh, well, that's selfish, isn't it? Because you're only doing it to satisfy yourself. And I don't really have, quite frankly, I've got such an exciting life, and I've had such exciting times. I don't spend a lot of time lying on a psychiatrist's bench trying to have a self-session.
I understand that, but it's the moral streak in you that has been, from my reading and my understanding of you, so fascinating. This abhorrence of cheating. The times when you were really, really upset about what happened in the conduct of government. You really have tried to lead a principled life in the jungle. It might seem as if it's a contradiction in terms. You called your book "Life in the Jungle," and the jungle seems to almost imply a place where there are no rules, where animal eats animal, etc. There's no morality there at all, and yet you hold out a belief that there has to be some kind of morality in the public sphere. That government has to be accountable. That ministers have to be accountable. We understand the ministers don't always have to tell the truth, but we don't really like them to tell lies either.
No, well, the truth is a very difficult thing in public life. I mean, you, me, in the end, we have loyalties and convictions, and life is not black and white. So, to what extent do you argue your case because you happen to think that it's the greater good? To what extent do you hide the truth when it can be very damaging for some person or organization if it comes out? I mean, I had a really simple example of this when I was minister responsible for selling Concord. And we hadn't sold any Concord. And the manufacturers had a list of, I think, 80 hot prospects, as they called it. And I was the minister responsible, and my civil servant said, "You're not going to sell any. There's no justification for this hot prospect list." So what do I do as a minister? Do I tell the country we've spent £1 billion on this project and we're not going to sell any? Do I undermine the sales effort of the company by saying, no, we don't think they're going to sell any? Or do I go out and try and sell it? Well, that's the dilemma you faced. And I went out and tried to sell it, knowing what my officials were saying. Where is truth?
Where is truth is one thing. Cheating and outright lies, cheating of colleagues is another. And there is a certain kind of, I believe, moral conduct of a government that sets the tone, the moral tone for the country. If you have a government in which individual ministers are corrupt, or blatantly lie, etc., that filters through and it affects the whole entire tenor of the country. Now, you fought and argued, for moral government. I'd be interested to know whether you think that at this point in time we have moral government.
I am worried about developments that I see. For example, I deplore absolutely the vilification of the civil service, which has crept into contemporary politics. I've worked with civil servants for many decades. They're hardworking, clever, interesting, and dedicated. And if there's a fault, it's the politician. Not all politicians are good enough for the ministerial jobs they hold. There are those who see ambition as conforming to the party line as opposed to pursuing what the evidence demands. And they don't stay long enough. I know that I was president of the Board of Trade. I think there'd been 13 people in that job in about a dozen years. And, that's ludicrous.
Well, it's really interesting because some questions have been coming through from our viewers and listeners this evening that have been emailed to me, and a lot of them on precisely this point. From Edward Layton, would you agree that the current crop of conservative politicians seem fundamentally incapable and unwilling to give a straight answer to a straight question? Well, I suppose that's a question which would have been put to politicians throughout the ages. Neville Eisenberg, do you worry about the quality of people entering politics today? Lindy Levin, my wife, in shaping the nature of the public sphere and its ethical qualities, do you not think government has a duty to invoke the rule of law on the basis of the harm principle to ensure that we rely on a force of accountability more substantial than how nice people are at any one moment?
Well, I mentioned that the first of my anxieties. I am appalled that the government can allow a minister to say to the House of Commons that their proposals are illegal and then whip the party to support what they themselves have said is to be illegal. But the House of Lords have done quite a bit about that, and it's a live issue now. We'll see what the government does. But I also think that the way in which party hacks have been allowed to penetrate into Downing Street it's taking the partisanship of politics too far into the decision making. It's obscuring the issues that you have rightly raised. And if I had been Prime Minister, I would have got rid of the special advisors. I think there has been a deterioration in the standards of public life. not personally, but they've accentuated the divisiveness. They formed little groups of cliques. My own experience before that was that civil servants were perfectly capable of giving advice that was necessary on a political basis.
I wonder if the problem, Michael, is a little bit deeper even than that. You know, there was an article in the Economist last week's issue relating to the way in which the government sets the moral tone of the nation. That's not the way in which they phrase it. It's the way in which I'm phrasing it. But what the leader and the Economist argued was it was called remaking the state, and it spoke about the government plan to, quote, unchain the executive by limiting judicial power, pushing back against devolution, and reforming the civil service. Now, if the tenor of a country flows from the defined balance of power in the relationship between the key institutions, is something going wrong in the country as we begin to shift some of those powers between these different organizations, with the executive taking an ever greater power? And does this not lie at the very heart of some of the problems that we're talking about?
Well, I've dealt with the issue of the civil service, and I've dealt with the issue of partisan activity in the machine-making, decision-making. So the third point I think you're raising is about devolution. And here I am very sad, because I think the devolution agenda, which David Cameron and George Osborne did a great deal to push in England, has just died on the vine, frankly. There's no enthusiasm to continue it. And my own view is that the post-Brexit challenges are seriously prejudiced because we are not galvanizing the strengths of our component parts of the English economy. It's a ludicrous situation that Scotland has got the powers that it has, whereas Manchester, which is a bigger economy, hasn't.
Yes.
And there is no doubt at all that the concept that Whitehall can devise solutions to the Brexit crisis and then impose them on the differing economies across our country is naive and frankly irresponsible. The point I made at the very beginning, that COVID is a curtain that is hiding these real challenges, and it certainly is. And if you look today, the national press is simply not interested in the detail of devolution. I'm afraid that too much of our press is sycophantic and supportive of the government, except on sensational issues like sort of Christmas and things like that. But the death of the big local newspapers is a serious weakening in the democratic accountability. But it could be dealt with. I mean, if the government would wake up to the opportunities of unleashing the powers of Manchester, Birmingham, Newcastle, Liverpool, Plymouth, Solent, and get on with devolution, then there is a huge feast, in my view, to be garnered, and a massive enthusiasm to be harnessed, if we just recognize that we're not just one economy, we have a series of vibrant, different economies which need different treatment.
Understood. I just need to put you the last question from our listeners in relation to government, and there's one on Europe and a couple on USA and Israel. Keith Moss says, year after year, we learn of yet another contract or project that has been grossly under budgeted. Is this because the government of the day does not want to face reality when placing the contract, or because of the incompetence of the civil servants or the minister in charge?
Well, which is the contract we're talking about? Or is it just general term? Well, look,
general, not a specific contract.
Government is not a good buyer. It never has been.
Well, that's the answer.
Because so often the projects get so large, and therefore the scale of the overspend is rather dramatic.
Yes.
But the only thing you can realistically say is that government has got to do better, and there is a public accounts committee which watches these things.
Yes.
But anyway,
Okay, we live in hope. Moira Bennington asks about Europe. Do you have a fear of the rise of the right as we leave the European Union, as England reverts to nationalism, as well as people like Nigel Farage becoming so vocal, visible, and persuasive?
Of course, I'm horrified by the growth of, at the fringe of, well, let's not minimize this. It's the Trump election was a classic example of this. Brexit was a serious example of it. And in parts of Europe, you can see it happening today, Hungary, Poland. What it's all about, of course, is the frustration of frozen living standards. And we've been through a very difficult period post 2008, and people are looking for change. And if you start down the change route, then they're easy targets. They're foreigners and immigrants.
Yes.
And there's nothing, there's nothing new in this, but there's nothing new in politics. All these things are time tested throughout history, in one form or another. Yes. And so you can see the frustrations, and if you get these frustrations, there will be people who exploit them. And Donald Trump and his friend Nigel Farage are classic examples of irritating the fringe.
It's a very strange business, this, because to be nationalistic or to be patriotic for one's country is an essential part of being a citizen. And yet it is so easy for it to become distorted and to turn into something else. I've never quite understood how such a positive and important component of a person's life as a citizen could be such a dangerous element that threatens the whole integrity of the country.
Oh, well, come on. What about the Wars of the Roses? And Lancashire and Yorkshire fought each other. All these things have been done. I mean, you think of 1,000 years of European history, where, I mean, you ask the average punter what it was that Britain was doing, England was doing, marching up and down France for all those years, and then what the great colonial wars of the 19th century were all about. They were just about the same basic human instincts of acquisitiveness and nationalism that we're all too familiar. I mean, Britain extraordinarily well came out on top, but
just another form of tribalism that you referred to earlier on. Yeah. Michael, just a couple of questions here, just before we bring this to a close. And these are an entirely different topic that we haven't touched on at all. Martin Isaacs wants to ask whether you consider the Democrats' record in America, in the United States of America, of engaging with Iran as a form of appeasement, and that it would be better that the sanctions against them were maintained. Do you have a view on that?
I'm not an expert on American-Iranian relationships. I fully understand the fear that Iran engenders in Israel, for example, and in the Middle East generally, and the Americans who are in a world leadership position can't do anything but become involved in the trying to broker a solution. We haven't got very far at the moment. I hope that there will be a new endeavor under the president-elect.
Right. And just finally, and again, I'm not sure that this is, is particularly an area that that you spent time on, but from Amit Green, what do you think of the Israel, UAE, and Bahrain recent peace accord brokered by President Trump? Is this as historic in your view as Camp David?
Well, I welcome so much the Israeli-Egyptian accord, which is now some considerable time ago. And I think that to find a solution whereby the Middle East solves its problems peacefully in dialogue and by constructive initiative is, well, frankly, I think it perhaps is one of the most challenging issues facing the modern society. I have, well, if I don't want to be alarmist, but if you you've said to me, where is the most dangerous part of the world that could face this country? Then the Middle East.
As it has been for a very long time.
As it has been. And it's just not the Arab-Israeli issue, the whole range of other issues which are all interspersed in it.
Absolutely. Well, I want to change the subject entirely, and as we come to the end, can I invite you to describe your vision of the Britain that you would like to bequeath to your 9 grandchildren, and the one in which you'd be happy for them to live in 5,000 words or less.
Well, that is a preposterous suggestion, if I may be aggressive for a minute. But I think that I want to see this country pull above its weight. I think that, warts and all, the contribution of this country is of extraordinary quality and longevity. And I believe that we have got to rejoin the Confederation of Europe as quickly as politically practical, and that Britain should use its voice and its energies and its imagination and its experience to help Europe to be a civilized part of the world power structure. I have not the slightest doubt that the globalization is going to divide the world into self-evident compartments. It's happening now and it's going to accelerate. And I think that Britain can be the most exciting country in configuration with one of those power groupings. I don't myself believe a word of the idea that we can do it on our own as a nation of 60 million people, with an economy that is medium-sized by standards of tomorrow. I think that the experiences of culture, of ethnicity, of balance, of tolerance, of civilized behavior, coupled with our incredible historic legacy, parliamentary legacy, historic legacy, economic legacy, is something which gives us a base in which to place our confidence in the future. But I hope that in all of our activities, we will seek to devolve power to a more regionally based sense of our economic strength, to involve people much more locally in their own destinies in partnership with the central government. I don't believe in absolutism in which you just say, let Manchester go or let Birmingham go, but I do believe that there is a partnership and a dialogue, and that the more my party, I believe in the end, my party is the preferred choice, the more my party can embrace the old slogan of trust the people, the stronger it will be.
Thank you. You've made us feel very proud to be British. What advice will you give now to the Jewish community of Great Britain of the ways in which we as a community can continue to contribute to the moral and social fabric of this country?
Why do you ask me for such advice when you've been so successful in doing it without my advice?
Because in the cacophony of sound that we hear in this country, it is sometimes a pleasure to hear a sane voice.
But look, you're doing well. You know, I'm pretty colorblind when it comes to Judaism. I have to tell you that my first girlfriend was Jewish, and the only complaint was her father, who didn't actually like the idea of me as a boyfriend. My 2 business partners, first 2 were Jewish.
It wasn't against the fact that you weren't Jewish, it was something to do with the hair.
Oh, you see the hair. Oh, well, well, I'm not going to give in on that. I would ever have been a public figure if I'd cut my hair short. I think it was.
And you've never been called Tarzan, so there you are.
Telling was the hair. My wife was telling me this. She's a shrewd observer of the scene.
Michael, thank you so much. It's really been a very great pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation.
I look forward to other opportunities, and I wish you and Anne and your children to continue to be well. Of course, to continue to take care of yourself until such time as we all get to the prick in our arm. And that is once again going to make us live forever one day. But really terrific. And thank you so much for coming on the program. Thank you for talking about it. And thank you for your really fascinating and really very, very wonderful insights. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.